Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 8, The Mobilization Interval. The mobilization of all the armies proceeded apace. The peoples of Europe were smoothly and swiftly drawn into the cogwheels of a long-prepared, all-powerful and intricate machinery of whose existence they had hitherto been only vaguely aware. The patiently elaborated plans of all the general staffs for the various wars that might have to be fought had been put into operation by a few simple decisions, and by every road and railway more than 12 million men were moving towards the battlefields. Censorship and secrecy cast their pall over the scene, and a strange hush descended upon Europe. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the German advance guards breaking into Belgium and by the Austrian invasion of Serbia. These two small countries at the opposite ends of the battle fronts were the first to feel the edge of the Teutonic swords. In each case, compelling motives actuated the invaders. The capture of Liège and the opening of the 4 lines of railway which passed through it were indispensable to the deployment of the German right wing. The rapid overrunning and subjugation of Serbia was no less urgent for Austria. If this could be accomplished in a 3 weeks campaign, as was generally believed, the bulk of the troops used against Serbia would be in time for the later phases of the opening battles with Russia. But a speedy, decisive victory over Serbia promised other consequences even more important. Germany had good hopes when the crisis began of gaining other adherents. The Triple Alliance included Italy, and a military convention was based on this fact. She was a party to Austria's secret treaty of alliance with Romania. She had a close understanding with Bulgaria, cemented by an identity of animosities against Serbia. She had considerable expectations of Greece, arising from the connection of the royal families. Lastly, on August 2, she had contracted an offensive and defensive alliance with Turkey. Thus, the whole of Southeast Europe was by presumption vowed or inclined to the Teutonic cause. Over all these confident expectations, the apparition of the British Empire as the ally of France and Russia had thrown a paralyzing chill. Italy had been the first to fall away. By a secret condition in the original treaty of the Triple Alliance, Italy had stipulated that she should not be obliged in any circumstances to go to war with England. The Austrian designs upon Serbia prejudiced Italian interests, and immediate claims for compensation in the Trentino were advanced. The historic feud and clash of interests between Italy and Austria came plainly into view. The position of the Italian army in Libya, and indeed the life of Italy itself, would be jeopardized in a war in which the command of the Mediterranean was lost or seriously endangered. On July 31, Italy, deaf to all appeals from Berlin and Vienna, explained that as Austria was the initial aggressor against Serbia, the casus foederis did not arise, and declared that she would remain neutral. The decision of Italy affected profoundly the attitude of Romania. King Carol, with his pro-German sympathies, pleaded the text of the secret treaty in vain. Opinion in Bucharest had been estranged by the terms of the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia, nor could Romania contemplate without alarm an increase of Bulgarian territory at Serbia's expense. Although as late as August 9 the Romanian chief of the staff inquired from Conrad at what points it would be convenient for the Romanian army to concentrate, the decision to remain neutral had already been taken. King Carol, overruled by statesmen of all parties, among whom Mr. Take Ionescu, always a sincere friend of England, played a prominent part, bowed in grief to the inevitable. Greece could not dissociate herself from Great Britain or from British sea power. The Young Turks, whose plans for war with Russia and conquests in the Caucasus were completed, found their hopes of gaining the command of the Black Sea destroyed by the impounding of the new-built Turkish battleship about to sail from the Tyne. Turkey was also affected by the sudden unexpected problems which a war with Great Britain would bring upon her. Bulgaria alone was found willing, under important reservations, to promise to march with the Central Powers when an opportune moment arrived. But the danger of offending Romania made the Central Empires hesitate to avail themselves of this aid. Thus the whole combination, which a generation of German diplomacy had been building, dissolved in a vapor of hesitations and polite disclaimers. The action of Great Britain also determined the attitude of her small but ancient ally, Portugal. And at the other side of the globe, the Empire of Japan, although the Anglo-Japanese alliance was not invoked, prepared herself to extirpate German influence in the Far East. Certainly the long-gathered associations and slowly woven ties which the influence of the British Empire had established were impressively effective. All the more important was it for Austria to clarify the Balkan situation by a speedy conquest and elimination of Serbia. The defeat of Serbia and her collapse might be the signal which several at least of the neutral states seemed to await before answering to the long-drawn and several times repeated trumpet call. Conrad had already taken his first military decision. It was a capital error, and its consequences were inexorable. The Austrian plans, like those of other countries, had been drawn for various contingencies. Plan B, Balkan, the smaller and more probable, was for war against Serbia and Montenegro, while Russia remained neutral. In B, 3 out of 6 Austro-Hungarian armies were to invade Serbia, the 5th and 6th from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the 2nd across the Save and Danube, while the other 3 armies took up precautionary defensive positions against possible Russian hostility in Galicia. Plan R, Russia, on the other hand, contemplated a war with Serbia and Russia simultaneously. In this case only the 5th and 6th armies, much weaker than the others and amounting to 12 divisions, were to invade Serbia from the west, while the 2nd Army was to join the main Austrian concentration in Galicia. Which to choose? On July 25, when Austria ordered mobilization, Conrad had chosen Plan B, Balkan. The origins of this surprising decision are found in the conversations and councils which have already been described, at which the chastisement of Serbia was resolved. The German blank check had arrived. It must be filled in at once and cashed, lest it should be stopped. To act promptly and with enormous force against Serbia was what the Germans had invited. It offered a chance of a rapid sudden success and a campaign over before Europe had recovered from her shock, and while diplomacy might still be endeavoring only to limit the conflict. This idea of an immediate decisive striking down and punishment of Serbia in a private war while the rest of the world was talking or keeping the ring had taken possession of Berchtold and his colleagues, and Conrad viewed the problem through their eyes. His own account is revealing. The diplomatic activities took as their goal only a war against Serbia. Consequently, mobilization and assembly for this must ensue. To break this off or to diminish the strength employed on account of the possibility of Russia's intervention was not feasible. It might well be, and diplomacy counted on it, that the action against Serbia would be completed without an interruption by other powers. This was the more likely to occur if a rapid, thorough success against Serbia forestalled the intervention of other powers. It followed that strong forces should be directed against Serbia from the outset, that is, that the complete mobilization be, and the assembly against Serbia involved in it should be ordered. This necessity was imposed upon us by the diplomatic action. He proceeds. Meanwhile, there was the danger that Russia would seize Austria's upraised arm, might threaten war or even actually resort to it. From a military point of view, therefore, the most desirable thing would have been to take the initiative against this danger and to treat the war against Serbia as a sideshow. But to do this on the strength merely of the possibility of Russian intervention was out of the question, since if Austria acted thus, the obligation on the part of her allies to cooperate would lapse. Moreover, Austria would thereby incur the grave charge of letting loose a world war, whereas the war against Serbia was merely a brutally imposed action of self-defense. For the diplomats, the situation was clear. It was otherwise for the Chief of the General Staff, who on the one hand must keep before him the rapid and decisive war against Serbia, but on the other must be prepared suddenly to divert everything towards a war with Russia. This was a dilemma, involving in itself the gravest responsibility and a most unfavorable situation from the point of view of operations. These reasons may be true or partly true, but they are not convincing. Conrad had misjudged what Russia would do and ignored the true proportions of the military problem. Already on July 25, the effects of the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia were apparent in every capital. By the 26th, the German government was conscious of a stern spirit in the powers of the Triple Entente. The Russian agitation was intense. The French had shown an icy calm. England had declared in the most public manner that her first and second fleets would remain concentrated. A situation of terrific intensity had been created. The idea that Austria would be suffered to invade and crush Serbia while all the other powers remained spectators was fantastic. Yet, under the prepossessions of a fortnight before, when Germany was believed to be wishing for vigor against Serbia, and in spite of the new vast peril of the situation, Plan B was put into operation and carried out in a purblind integrity. It is vain for Conrad to shield himself behind diplomacy. Nothing could supersede the military situation for which he was responsible. The life and death fortunes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire depended upon the Russian action. If Russia invaded Austria, every man would be needed. Until a battle had been fought between Russia and Austria, no entanglement of Austro-Hungarian forces in Serbia could be tolerated. If, on the other hand, Russia, confronted with the armed might of Germany, lowered her sword, the chastisement of Serbia would be easy and sure. A very few days would settle the question one way or the other. Conrad had only to reply to those who pressed him to strike down Serbia. We shall know very soon whether it is to be Plan B or Plan R, and I insist upon that delay, even if we lose our advantage against Serbia. But impatient to strike the detested enemy, he underrated the chances of Russian action, and though the briefest pause would have given him certainty, launched the imperial armies on an erroneous premise. On July 31, the general mobilization of Russia was in full progress. On the same afternoon, the Kaiser telegraphed to the Emperor as follows: "The preliminary mobilization of my entire army and of my navy, which I have ordered today, will be followed in the shortest possible time by definite mobilization. I count the 2nd of August as the first day of mobilization and am prepared, in fulfillment of my duties as an ally, to begin war against Russia immediately. In this momentous struggle, it is of the greatest importance that Austria should direct her main forces against Russia and should not divide her forces by an offensive against Serbia. This is the more important as a large part of my army will be tied by France. In the battle of giants into which we are entering shoulder to shoulder, Serbia plays quite a subsidiary part, which calls only for such defensive measures as are absolutely necessary. A successful issue of the war, and with it the existence of our monarchies, is only to be hoped for if both of us move with our full strength against our new and mighty opponents. I beg of you further to do all you can by meeting her wishes to induce Italy to take part. All else must be subordinated to the entry of a united Triple Alliance into the war. Wilhelm. So here is the whole web of illusion torn to pieces, and Conrad and the Austrian leaders are face to face with a hideous reality of an immediate Russian invasion, which their ally is urging them to meet with their fullest strength. On paper, Plan B was automatically superseded by Plan R. It was now necessary to send the Second Army to the north. However, it was already in its trains for the opposite direction. A spring had been released and the highly complicated process was in active progress. To arrest the movement of the Second Army in mid-transit would throw the whole organization into confusion. No course was open but to allow its 8 divisions to complete their journey to the Serbian frontier, detrain at their appointed sidings, proceed to their assembly points, and then, in their proper order of arms and units, re-enter their trains and be carried to Galicia. This return journey could not begin effectively till August 18. There was the consolation that the mere arrival of this army on the Serbian frontier would draw off a proportion of the Serbian forces and thus aid the 5th and 6th Austrian armies. Conrad was thus forced to pretend a necessity where none existed, and to make a virtue of it, if possible. He says, "The 1st, 3rd and 4th armies were on the way occupying all assembly transport routes towards Galicia, while the 2nd Army was arriving, to start with, on the Save and Danube, and would not follow the above-named armies until after the lines of approach to Galicia had become free. If these orders, imposed by necessity, had the advantage that until the 2nd Army was withdrawn from the Save and Danube, the enemy would find himself threatened there and would be compelled to hold forces to oppose them. Yet there was also the danger that the forces of the 2nd Army might become involved in hostilities against Serbia. The great river barrier, of course, diminished this danger." He felt the need of offering some explanation to his military colleague upon the strange peregrinations to which his 2nd Army was condemned. He wrote to Moltke on August 1, dated August 2. "Your Excellency, at this fateful moment I am impelled to place myself in direct relations with you in order to make certain of that full unity which I have always kept as my objective. We hoped to wage this as a localized war without further complications. The endeavor of all the powers to localize the war strengthened us in this belief. It is natural that we should assemble for this localized war sufficient forces to hold out a prospect of success by weight of numbers. When Russia, by mobilizing her southern military districts, showed herself hostile to the monarchy, we turned to Germany with the request that she would declare that this step taken against us would also be unacceptable to Germany. At the same time, mobilization of the remainder of the army was ordered, for their assembly in Galicia was envisaged. At this stage we are obliged, as indeed Germany also urgently wished, to declare openly that our hostile measures were only directed against Serbia and that further mobilization were merely a measure of protection against the threat from Russia. It was hoped that these measures, in conjunction with the energetic diplomatic pressure of the other powers, more especially Germany, would restrain Russia from hostile action against the monarchy, and would also afford to the latter the possibility of carrying through her action against Serbia. Such being the case, we could and must hold fast to the idea of the offensive against Serbia. The more so since we had to bear in mind that Russia might merely intend to restrain us from action against Serbia by a threat, without proceeding to war against us. While, however, the powers, and above all Germany, were only intervening diplomatically, Russia did not discontinue her mobilization, but made it general. Meanwhile, our movements destined against the south began to take place. From the diplomatic activities of that time it was, in our opinion, apparent that Germany, if we were attacked by Russia, would indeed fulfill her duties as an ally, but that she would rather avoid a great war. Thus we were obliged to hold to our intention to proceed with our action against Serbia, and to entrust our protection against Russia, against whom we could not by ourselves initiate an offensive war, to our troops which were to assemble in Galicia, and to the German threat to Russia and the influence of the remaining powers. It was not until July 31 that there came suddenly the decided declaration of Germany that she herself was now willing to carry through the Great War against France and Russia. This produced an entirely new situation. It was immediately reckoned here that we must put in the preponderating mass of our forces in the north, and I beg Your Excellency to accept the assurance that, in spite of the great complications caused by our transport of troops to the south, which has already been completed, this will be carried through. The full force of Plan B had been put into operation against Serbia concurrently with the Austrian mobilization on July 25. The dual monarchy declared war upon Serbia on the 28th, and 3 Austrian armies moved towards the Serbian frontier. The position of the Serbians seemed forlorn. Northern Serbia is lapped and bound on 3 sides by the Danube and its tributary, the Save, into which the Drina flows. Belgrade, the capital, stood actually upon the Danube at the frontier and was undefendable. 3 army corps comprising 8 divisions of the Austrian Second Army began to deploy along the northern frontier, while the 5th and 6th Austrian armies, each comprising 2 corps, about 11 divisions, advanced to invade Serbia from the west. The Serbian commander-in-chief, the voivode Putnik, could not tell whether the main hostile advance would be made from the north or the west. He did not know, as we know, that the Austrian Second Army detraining to the northward was from August 2 under orders to scramble back into its trains and hurry to the Russian front in Galicia. All he saw was the marshalling and deployment of powerful forces upon both frontiers. Indeed, he believed that the main invasion would come upon him from the north. The Serbian army consisted of 11.5 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, in all 180,000 rifles, 8,500 sabres, and 500 guns. To the southward, in the mountainous and broken country behind the upper Drina, the Montenegrins gathered 40,000 strong. The Serbian forces were divided into 3 so-called armies, each of which, however, was little stronger than an Austrian army corps. Leaving detachments to observe the frontier and delay the invasion, General Putnik assembled his 3 armies in the center of northern Serbia, facing north with their left upon the town of Valjevo, and with covering troops along the rivers. These prudent dispositions, although facing north in error, enabled the front to be easily and swiftly changed to meet the real attack from the west. The deployment of the Austrian armies around the Serbian frontiers marshaled some 19 divisions against the Serbian 11.5, and these, by their geographical position, seemed able to advance now from one side, now from the other, to turn the flank or rear of any position occupied by their weaker antagonists. In addition, behind all, low down on the eastern border, Bulgaria waited, armed and silent, with memories of recent unutterable injuries to avenge. But the Serbians, seasoned, war-hardened men, inspired by the fiercest patriotism, the result of generations of torment and struggle, awaited undaunted whatever fate might bestow. The command of the 2 armies destined to invade Serbia was confided to General Potiorek, whom we have already met as governor of Bosnia on the fatal day of Sarajevo. Podgoric had a strong position with the court. He had served under Baron Bolfras for some years. He was intimate with the emperor. His favor had survived unharmed the many indignant comments which the faulty and neglectful police arrangements of June 28 had excited. His nerves were, however, seriously affected by the tragedy. Throughout his campaigns against Serbia, he kept himself closely within his guarded headquarters. Thence he directed the operations and used his influence with the emperor to procure the largest number of troops for the longest possible time, regardless of the general situation. In particular, he clamored unceasingly for the use of the Second Army, and Conrad was soon engaged in a serious dispute with him about it. Podgoric knew that the Second Austrian Army was strictly forbidden to cross the Save-Danube line and must begin its departure for Galicia on the 18th. Nevertheless, he ordered his Fifth and Sixth Armies to invade Serbia upon two widely separated and divergent lines. The Fifth Army, advancing on August 12, was to reach Valjevo on the 17th. The Sixth Army, to the southward, starting between August 14 to 18, would move on to Užice. Meanwhile, the Second Army would demonstrate especially against Mitrovica and Šabac, and threaten to cross the Save from the north. It followed from this plan that the Austrian Fifth Army would have to fight practically the whole of the Serbian forces single-handed, for the Second Army was soon departing and the Sixth Army was out of contact to the southward, preoccupied with maintaining the loyalty of Bosnia, and wandering off to engage the Montenegrins, and 1.5 Serbian divisions coming from Užice. The relative strength of the combatants was thus transformed. The 6 Austrian divisions of the 8th and 13th Corps might expect to meet the bulk of the Serbian army, actually 10 divisions, somewhere between the Drina and the Kolubara, or behind the latter river itself. Podgoric hoped, of course, that the threat of the Second Army from the north and the Bulgarian danger in the east would lead the Serbians to disperse their forces. General Putnik, in what may well have seemed to him a desperate situation, found safety by running risks. He kept his 3 armies together in his central position, determined to hurl their whole strength at whichever of the foes who encircled his country first exposed themselves to battle. On August 12, the Austrian Fifth Army began its advance and crossed the Drina between Zvornik and Ljubovia, meeting determined resistance from the Serb covering troops as they fell back slowly. The Fourth Corps from the Second Austrian Army entered Šabac almost unopposed. The direction of the invasion being now defined, Putnik swung his Third and Second Armies to face west behind the Dobrava and Jadar rivers, while the First Army followed them up. By August 15, the right of the Austrian advance had reached the neighborhood of Krupani and Zavalak on the Jadar, while its left approached the Dobrava, which flows into the Save below Šabac. Their center was still an hour from the township of Terkerish at nightfall. A heavy storm in the evening brought all movements to an end. Meanwhile, Putnik, marching swiftly forward from the Kolubara, placed his Second and Third Armies ready for battle from the Save below Šabac to Krupani. He held his First Army in reserve to guard against the attacks which he must fear from the Second Austrian Army across the Save between Šabac and Obrenovac. On August 16, what has been called the Battle of the Jadar began. Fierce fighting ensued on the front of about 30 miles. The Serbian left, threatened on both flanks by the advance of Podgoric's 13th Corps, retired beyond Krupani. But in the north, among maize fields and thick intersected blind country, the Austrian advance from Šabac was repulsed with heavy loss. Even worse were Austrian fortunes on the front of the 8th Corps in the center. The 21st Schützendivision, composed mostly of Czechs, met with grave disaster and were driven in rout from the key position of the whole battle. Treachery and cowardice were imputed to these unwilling soldiers, who, after a prolonged disorderly flight, resembled, beyond the Drina, only 3,000 strong. Night fell with the Austrian centre broken and driven back upon the Drina, and with the Austrian left repulsed by heavy losses and also compromised by the disaster in the centre. That same night Conrad, with the titular commander-in-chief, the Archduke Frederick, left Vienna for Przemysl, his headquarters against Russia. Here, on August 17, he learned Podjorek's unpleasant news. It raised a poignant issue. The Second Army, already so long delayed, was due to leave the Serbian front on the 18th. There was not an hour to lose, but its departure at this moment might well entail the complete defeat of the Fifth Army and the failure of the whole plan against Serbia. On the other hand, its intervention promised an almost certain victory, which would or might bring in Bulgaria and Turkey. Already during the night of the 16th, Conrad had consented to allow the Second Army to demonstrate in force along the Save to conceal the fact of its impending departure and to pin down the enemy. Now Podjorek demanded its full support, and a few minutes later the Second Army itself reported the retreat of the northern wing of the Fifth Army, and that its own Fourth Corps was advancing towards Shabatz to their assistance. Meanwhile, beyond the frontiers of Galicia, the Russian masses must be gathering in enormous strength, and the battle of the nations drew near. Tossed on the horns of his self-created dilemma, Conrad allowed the Second Army to throw the Fourth Corps in towards Shabatz, if this was judged necessary in order to achieve success. But that evening came a further wire from Podjorek. His demands had increased with his distresses. The intervention of the Second Army in Driblitz might, he declared, lead to a reverse. They should cross the Save in force not only at Shabatz, but lower down. Until they had to depart to Galicia, surely they could not remain passive onlookers. The Second Army themselves wired, "Are we to leave the Fourth Corps behind or to move as arranged?" Conrad thereupon ordered the departure in principle of the Second Army, but agreed that the Fourth Corps might remain until the Shabatz situation was resolved. The fighting continued on the 18th and 19th. The Austrian Fourth Corps drove back the Serbian right, and the Serbians fell back behind the Dobrava. But the Serbian Second Army, reinforced by a division from its First Army, threw back the remainder of the Austrian Eighth Corps on Lüschnica, while their Third Army held its own in the south. The whole of the Austrian Fifth Army was now in a grievous position. A week's hard fighting in hot weather and difficult country against a hardy enemy, and with poor artillery support, had exhausted its strength. Supplies, both of ammunition and food, were running low. Its center and left were hard-pressed and retiring. Its left flank was about to be exposed by the withdrawal of the Second Army. In these circumstances, its commander, Frank, ordered the general retirement of the army beyond the Drina River. Podjorek's report on the evening of the 19th ended, "Fifth Army in retreat. One division of 8th Corps has been dispersed and the other has suffered very heavily. The 13th Corps is intact. The 4th Corps at Shabatz is engaged with equal numbers of the enemy. Result not yet known. The help asked for," he added ungraciously, "came 2 days too late." Conrad and the Austrian headquarters now took a hard decision. They determined to cut the loss in Serbia and at all costs to prevent the Second Army becoming involved there. Podjorek challenged this ruling. If the Second and the Sixth Armies cannot forthwith take the offensive as a set-off to the defeat of the Fifth, My task of keeping the Serbs off the soil of the monarchy will be very difficult. And further that he was holding the 3 divisions in readiness. He now exerted all his influence at Vienna. The emperor's military cabinet intervened. Berchtold on Podgoryk's side invoked diplomacy and the prestige of the monarchy in the Balkans. Despite the appeals of the Archduke Frederick, Conrad and the Austrian headquarters were overruled by the emperor, and Podgoryk was placed in independent command of all the army corps engaged against Serbia and Montenegro. He was to lead them to further disasters. It was not until August 30 that Conrad was able to disentangle the missing 4th Corps. The Austrian entry into the field illustrates once again the commonest of all great military errors. It is the error most easy to perceive in theory and most difficult to avoid in action. There are 2 enemies and 2 theaters. The task of the commander is to choose in which he will prevail. To choose either is to suffer grievously in the neglected theater. To choose both is to lose in both. The commander has for his guides the most honored principles of war and the most homely maxims of life. First things first. Being before well-being. What you do, do well. Always be strongest at the point of attack. It is the application of these simple rules to the facts that constitutes the difficulty and the torment. A score of good reasons can be given not only for either course, but also for the compromises which ruin them. But the path to safety nearly always lies in rejecting the compromises. We have seen how Conrad was led astray by forces and reasons which seemed to him irresistible. We shall presently see Moltke and his successor Falkenhayn succumbing under the same pressures. We shall also watch their effects upon Lord Kitchener and the British War Committee. Until Conrad pressed the button which set Plan B in motion, he had the choice of 2 sound operations. The first was to neglect Serbia and concentrate every man and gun, apart from troops needed to prevent or even merely to delay the Serbian invasion of Austria, upon his long-awaited offensive against Russia. The second was to crush Serbia, invading from every side at once in overwhelming force, and thus probably bring Bulgaria and Turkey, if not indeed Romania, at once into the field as allies. But this entailed standing on the defensive in Galicia. He must retire, fighting delaying actions for as long and as far as might be necessary, yielding mile by mile the soil of the monarchy till Serbia had been annihilated. Of these 2 plans the former was the more magnificent, but the latter offered great prizes. Moreover, a delaying strategy by Austria at the beginning of the war consorted naturally with the Schlieffen Plan. The Germans hoped to be victorious in the west within 6 weeks from mobilization, and would then return to the east with ample power. If Conrad could keep alive and unbeaten against Russia for that period, he had every right to count on strong German aid, and with this aid, even if the Russians had crossed the Carpathians, all could quickly have been regained. Meanwhile he would have settled with Serbia and perhaps have gained Turkey and Bulgaria. From the moment that he had given the order which irrevocably sent his Second Army to the Danube and kept it out of the opening battles in Galicia, only this latter alternative was rightly open to him. It was his paramount duty to make the Second Army fight somewhere at the crucial moment. It could no longer reach Galicia in time to fight there. It must therefore fight in the station into which it had got, and win a decision there. It followed that Conrad must renounce his offensive against Russia, about which already he had so many misgivings, and adopt dilatory tactics till the Franco-German issue was declared. But in fact he did neither. He fooled away the power of the Second Army in both theaters. It left Podgorek before it could win him a victory. It returned to Conrad in time to take part in his defeat.